and welcome to this MFL SOS free CPD session for Language Nuts. We're going to be talking about practical tips for teaching phonics today. My name's Zoe Thorne and I'll be presenting with my colleague Elaine Gelther today. So today, as I said, my name's Zoe and I'm the head of content at Language Nuts. I've also written quite a few IGCSE and A-level textbooks and also EFL textbooks, or ELT. And my colleague Elaine has lots and lots of experience as a teacher of MFL and director of education at Language Nuts, and a wealth of experience. So what we're going to be talking about is phonics. Why are we teaching phonics explicitly? We hope that the fact that you're here means you think that phonics might be quite a good idea, but why should we actually teach it explicitly and not just just kind of teach it as part of what we're doing? How do you do that? So you want to teach phonics, how do you embed that into your teaching systematically? Instead of just doing it on an ad hoc basis? How do you introduce sounds, and then how do you practice pronunciation really explicitly and effectively? And then we're going to give you tons and tons of ideas for activities you can do with phonics. We want to make this as practical as possible and to fill this full of things that you can do with your students tomorrow if possible, because we know that your time is very precious. So I'll get started straight away, and then my colleague Elaine will be coming in from time to time. She's got lots of expertise and information as well. So why will we bothering to teach phonics explicitly? And the main reason is that it gives you more confidence, not just in speaking, but also in listening, because it involves being able to hear the differences. And if you can hear, you can decode. It makes it easier to kind of transfer what you hear into sort of written words, and to really understand the differences. You know, you've got barriers between words, and then also in writing as well, because if you know your sound spelling links, if you're working with a phonetic language, something like German or Spanish, where by and large you have phonetic rules, that really helps you then with your spelling as well if you learn those links. It means that when you're learning new vocabulary, the students can be far more independent, because you don't have to spend all your lesson time kind of drilling it. They can see new words, they can decode at least part of it with the sound spelling rules and work out how they might say it. I know was nice to think about the exams, but it is true that if your students have a better accent, they can make a better impression on the examiners. So obviously examiners try to mark sort of speaking or talking exams as fairly as they can. Of course they do, but at the same time, I'm sure we've all been there when you've been marking something where you hear something, and if the student has got a really good r or a really good u or whatever, and they have a really good accent, your general impression is that they are more competent. And conversely, they can have fantastic grammar and vocabulary and so on. Of course, you're listening out for that. But if they sound really, really English and they have a very poor accent, one, you might not actually pick up all the really nice structures that they're making, especially in something like a language like French, where the grammatical tenses are very, very similar to each other. And also, you just might not get that impression that they're as good a speaker. So it really, really helps. A good pronunciation is so useful when you're talking about, when you're making a good impression for the examiners. And of course, much more importantly, that is when you're in the real world, when you're talking to people. We all know what it's like if you're abroad and you don't speak the language very well, you're trying to make yourself understood. If you have just learned from a phrase book and you don't have very good pronunciation, then it's harder to make yourself understood. People have to work, and we've possibly heard that, been on the receiving end of that with other people who are learning English, and it's difficult to understand what they mean. So that means it has a really real world practical application as well. And finally, it really improves students' motivation and their confidence. So because they do know when they sound good or not. And if, either in real life or in the classroom, if they say, une pan s'il vous plaît, they know that doesn't sound right. They feel stupid. They don't really want to speak. Whereas if they've got a pretty good accent, and if that accent is really celebrated in the classroom, and all the students start to feel really good about it because they're practicing it, they're more likely to want to speak. Which means that they can really develop their language skills. So those are some really good reasons for teaching phonics explicitly. The other things which are just sort of additional bits of information is that students will certainly in the UK will be used to it from their literacy lessons at primary. So that's something that's kind of changed in recent years, because there is much more of an explicit phonics approach in English in primary. So they are used to decoding and separating words into sounds and so on, and looking at sound spelling links explicitly. And the other thing to bear in mind is that whatever teaching approach you use, phonics can only be helpful. So fine, if you're following a sort of NCELP approach, then you have the pillars, and that's fine. You're used to your vocabulary, phonics and grammar. Fair enough, that's all part of it. But even if you don't currently, say if you use more of a sort of sentence building approaches or different or less grammar approach or whatever, it's still really useful for those as well, because if you're using sentence builders, for example, then it helps students to be able to pronounce the things that they see in their sentence builder. So whatever approach you use, we really would recommend teaching phonics explicitly. And my colleague Elaine is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Zoe. Obviously, the current GCSE specifications up until 2025 in England, you can see here the bullet points that I've highlighted. The accurate pronunciation and intonation. Students should be able to specific differences of the spoken language, certain relationships between sound patterns, and as Zoe said, marks are given for pronunciation and intonation in the speaking exam. In the programme of study for Key Stage 2 in England, obviously we can see there that pronunciation and intonation, exploring the patterns and sounds of language and the sound, spelling, sound and meaning of words, and developing accurate pronunciation when they are reading aloud. And in Key Stage 3, we've got the transcribing words and short sentences and speaking coherently with increasingly accurate pronunciation. And then for primary Scotland, they start in their primary by reading aloud words, and that goes up to short texts. And then in the N5 Scotland, which is the equivalent of GCSE, in the mark scheme, the pronunciation and intonation has to be understood by a speaker of the language. And as we move on to the next slide, we think about what we've just read about the read aloud and what Zoe mentioned about decoding. For those of us that teach in England, we know that the new GCSE specification, which is due to be sat from 2026, which affects the current year 7, is obviously something that we're all sort of waiting for the new specifications to come out from the exam boards. But you can see there that for the first time with the new GCSE, we're moving beyond assessing isolated skills of listening, reading, speaking and writing. We're moving towards sound, spelling, correspondence links, and also the assessments are going to be multimodal, which is for us is the first time that listening and writing and reading and writing will be assessed, and pupils need to be able to demonstrate their ability to transcribe and to decode with the dictation that they'll have to do of a short spoken extract with a certain number of words in, which is clearly visible in the new specifications. You can see all the numbers there that they've included with the number of words that they have to do, but also they have to read aloud a short written text. And they have to be able to read that aloud, and then at the same time they're going to have to be able to answer some questions that you will ask them about the conversation. So again, all of the sound, spelling, symbol correspondences that you need if you are in England and you are going to be teaching in the new GCSE are carefully laid out in the annexes in the document. Okay, back over to you, Zoe. Great,
thanks very much. So hopefully made the case for why you should be teaching phonics explicitly. Now, obviously, the main question is, how do you do that? We would recommend as much as possible to embed phonics systematically into your teaching. So to put it into your scheme of work, if you can. So you could, one way to do that is to have a sound of the week or sounds of the week. So it could be one sound or potentially two sort of easily confused sounds, for example, like oo and ü, which you get, for example, in German and in French. I'll be using examples from different languages as we go through, but obviously my languages that I'm most familiar with are French and German, so I apologise in advance for the bias towards those. I will try to use references to other languages as well. And I should have said at the beginning as well, as we go through, if you have any questions, please do put them into the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end. So yeah, thinking about if you might have a sound of the week, try to make that sound or those sounds related to the vocabulary as possible, obviously to make your life a bit easier. So for example, if you're teaching French and you're doing the topic of family, you might have an sound, so you have like mère, frère, père, that sound comes in all the time. If you're teaching German and you're doing the weather, then V is a really good one to have, because you have Wie ist das Wetter heute, in Winter ist es windig. So you can find sounds that really go with the vocabulary that you're teaching as much as possible. Try to alternate or to have a mixture at least of vowels and consonants. So if it gets a bit vowel heavy, it can be sometimes a bit confusing. You also want some high frequency sounds as much as possible, but then also mixing with the high difficulty ones. So for example, in French, a r sound is pretty difficult. So you might want to have that. If you've got that one week, then have a simpler one like a b, which is already in the student's first language, if that language is English, and so on. So trying to make it a mixture, and also interleave, so come back to previous sounds as well. So it's really helpful if you can sit down with your scheme of work and try to plot that across your year groups. It might be something that you try to do for all of your classes at the same time. It can be a little bit difficult finding the right vocabulary. Obviously, you might be doing different topics at the same time. This is for secondary teachers, but it can be useful to say, right, this is my sound of the week, and I have this on a display in your classroom, or it might be something you do probably a bit easier to have it one for each class that you teach if you were a secondary teacher. And then in that week, in your lessons that week, you might have some kind of reward for identifying or using those sounds. So for example, students can point out words that you use in the classroom, and if they have the sound of the week in them, they can get a house point, or you might have a tally chart with names on, and whoever at the end of the lesson has identified or used explicitly the most words with that sound in, can get points, a reward of some kind, depending what your school's reward system is. And you might have little flashcards, for example, especially if you're doing contrasting sounds. So you could have little flashcards, and students wave it when they hear whichever one that they hear you say. Again, you using it, or even better if they hear other students using it. So you can really encourage them to be listening to each other as much as possible. Mini whiteboards are another way you can do that, so they can wave those when they hear them. Another thing you can do is having the best pronunciation of the lesson. So by the end of the lesson, whoever you feel has used really got that pronunciation of that word correctly, they could have some rewards. So you're really trying to build it into the reward systems that you use and the scheme of work that you use. It could be either a consistent part of the lesson, so some teachers do it with this is a 5-minute starter, and it's always a phonics starter, or it could be a consistent part of a stage. So for example, whenever you do new vocabulary, you look at the phonics, and it might be a sound of the week, or it might be just this is when we look at the different phonics sounds of that, but trying to make it consistent, whatever that is, whether it's a specific part of the lesson or a specific time in the lesson. And there are lots of schemes of work that you can use for this. So obviously, if you use NCELP, they have phonics built into them. Rachel Hawkes has lots of resources on her website as well. If you're a LanguageNet subscriber, we have divided up key sounds from each language and put easily confused sounds next to each other. For example, like I and E in the example you can see on the screen there from German, or U and Ü. So you can use those and you can follow those one per week. Try to get students into the habit of thinking about the phonics whenever they're learning new vocabulary. So something that I used to use a lot, and you can see an example of it here, is if they wrote out their vocabulary, because they have vocabulary books in the last school I taught at, they would write target language, they'd write their own language, English or whatever their first language was. If they had English as an additional language, I would also get them to use their own. And then I would get them to write their own phonetic transcription, which made sense to them, because what I wrote might not actually make sense to them, because it depends on so many factors. It depends on how you read, it depends on your own accent, and so on, your own perspective. So you can see, for example, you've got, ich wohne, I live, and then the student has written it as ich. They've got a k, they know that's a k sound. They've underlined it because they know it's a tricky one. And then wohne, like wohne, so they know it's not wony or whatever. And they've written it out like that. And I don't mind how they write it, as long as it makes sense to them. And that means that it's really useful for them when they go home and they're not in the classroom, because they can see that and they can see their own notes. They know how to pronounce it. So I find that really helpful. If you're a school that uses booklets or knowledge organisers or whatever, they can highlight, they can annotate it as well. But yeah, they could highlight in different colours all the sound of the week in that particular bit that they're doing. So, but get them into the habit, make it part of them learning new vocabulary. Another thing you can do is have a kind of bank of sounds. So this could be a display of some kind. This is as you go through the year or through the term, the sounds that you've been practicing so far, the phonics that you've been doing. So they can really see, look, we've been collecting these. And something I used to do with my year 7s, or works really well in primary as well, is a phonics driving license. So I made a kind of, booklet similar to a passports, which had all the phonics that we will be looking at that year. And as part of the lesson, when I heard them demonstrating that they could pronounce it really well, and they could also recognize it and the sound spelling links, then I would give them a little stamp or a tick or initial or whatever, and then they were really trying to fill that in. And that gives them such a really nice sense of motivation at the end of like, hey, I can pronounce all of these sounds. I know how they're generally spelt in the target language, and I can spell them myself. And yeah, it's a sound of achievement. And then finally, when last year, it was actually more or less this time last year, we had the MFL question time session, and one of our guests, Rachel Hawkes, had a really good idea, which is that she had a session with parents at the beginning of the year to get them on board, where she would teach them some basic phonics and get them to get the parents to be able to pronounce words really, really well, which is useful for motivation, because it gets them, they feel good about languages, especially if they've had negative experiences with languages themselves when they were at school, which unfortunately we know can be the case. And also it means it's really useful because they can help their children practice at home. So they're not reinforcing bad pronunciation at home afterwards when they're going through, revising for a vocabulary test or whatever. So that can be really useful. Next, how do you introduce sounds specifically? So there's been a lot of research done about this into how we can produce sounds. And one of the things which is known is that in order to be able to pronounce a sound, you have to be able to hear the difference. So I'm sure lots of us have experienced this. If you have speakers of a language which is very different to English, they might make mistakes. So, for example, lots of native Spanish speakers might mispronounce words with b and v in them because they can't hear a difference between those two, because they don't really exist in that differentiated way in Spanish. So they can't pronounce the words properly because they can't hear them. So that's why it's really, really important to be able to get students to hear the difference. There's lots of really interesting research into first language acquisition, so where there's a critical period when babies or children are very, very young, and they essentially hear all the sounds around them. They work out which sounds are important to them. Basically, they build their phonetic inventory. They know which sounds are in their language or languages that are spoken around them, and then they kind of forget about the others because it takes up valuable brain power. They don't need to know the differences between sounds that aren't in the languages that they hear, which is why it's much harder as an adult to be able to hear the differences and therefore pronounce those. It's not impossible, we know. I mean, for any of us who are linguists but who are not native speakers of the languages that we teach, we've been able to do it, hopefully. So it is possible, but you need lots and lots and lots of practice of hearing the difference. Once you can hear the difference, you can then replicate that. So just parroting it back, humans are very good at doing that. Then you can produce it independently. So you can produce that word, for example, that sound at word level later on. And then finally, the next stage is being able to extrapolate the rules and the sound spelling links to new words. So you can pronounce this U sound or whatever, and then you see another word which is written with the whatever the spelling of that in the target language that you're speaking is, and then you can pronounce that. So you can look at unfamiliar words and pronounce them using those rules. So that's what we're trying to do. So that's what's really, really important, to start with the hearing the difference, which is why where appropriate, I would recommend introducing new vocabulary orally first. It won't always work. Sometimes you want to look at cognates and so on, and you might want to introduce vocabulary in the kind of way where you match them up and so on. Might not always work, but what it does mean is that you can get students to hear and pronounce the words correctly before they get put off by the spelling. So a classic thing that happened to me, and I'm sure something very similar has happened to lots of you, is I teach my students, okay, the word for because in French is parce que, we all produce it, we do core repetition, lovely, lovely. A little bit later, they read the word and they go parce que. So it's not parce que, we know it's not parce que, it's parce que, we've been practicing this. And the same thing happens with groß in German. How many times have you heard them say grob, even though you know they know the word groß and they've said the word groß? Or in Spanish, me llamo. Me llamo is literally the first thing we learn. You know, this happens all the time. That means you're kind of at one of those middling stages. But hopefully if you get them to do it orally first, although they might well still make that mistake later on when they read it, they've had an early success of pronouncing it properly, which they can kind of hook onto and they can go back to. So I would recommend that. Where possible. You might want to link it to gestures or sounds. So sometimes there can be particular gestures which emphasize some kind of memory hook that goes with the sound. And this is an idea which comes from Sue Cave. She has her physical phonics. Some of you might not know, Sue Cave was one of the consultants for the LanguageNet primary content. So she's been really involved in our primary content, and she's got lots of great resources. And she's also got a 7-step process for embedding phonics, which I've got there in the corner. So that comes from her. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend checking out her resources as well. Then you can play some different games where you look at introducing the sounds and in distinguishing between them. So this or that is a really simple one. This can be done whole class or with individual students. So you have 2 pronunciations of the word and you get students to choose which one is correct. So you say, you know, you're doing an U sound. So is it grün or is it groen? Which one's right, which one has the sound or which one is right, and they can do that. You know, this can be just questioning, this can be done with mini whiteboards, this can be done with, you know, a hand up or whatever. Another classic one, beat the teacher, but use contrasting sounds. So if you say a word, if you say it correctly, they repeat it. If you say it incorrectly, they don't repeat it. So if I say grün, the whole class repeats grün. If I say groen, the class doesn't. Obviously, you have to make sure you're working with nonsense words at this one, or you're focusing on a particular sound, because it can be difficult if you have minimal pairs where the other word is also a word. TPR, so looking at total physical response, you can read out a sentence or a word, and if they hear a key sound, they react physically in some way, they stand up, they wave. This is, you know, really, really good at primary or in early years of secondary, to get students, doing some kind of physical movement to react to that. They can wave flashcards again as well, and you can give you can do some cool repetitions, and get them to do it with different ways of doing it, so quietly, loudly, different groups and so on. You could read something aloud and divide the class into 2 teams, and get them to either shout out particularly their words with the sounds in, or to react in some way. And then finally, again, this is what you can do is, if you focus on the phoneme or the sound first, blend it into the syllable and then expand into the word as much as possible. This is again something that comes from Sue Cave. So for example, you might have the a and on sounds in French. So first of all, can they say a and can they say on? Then can they do it with just a syllable? So you add a consonant onto it, so ma and mon. It doesn't matter if they're words or not. And then finally, once they can do that, then they can do proper words. So they can, if they can say un, they can say ma, they can say mas. If they can say on, they can say mon, they can say montou. So really building up as much as possible so they get that confidence. If you're a LanguageNet subscriber, we've got lots and lots of games to help students in those different stages, so hearing the differences. I've put some GIFs on here so you can have a look. They're really good fun, and it's something that I'm really proud to be involved in with this. So the first one is a penguin game, where you have a sound. They hear a sound, they hear a word with that sound in, and they have to decide. In this case, it's Spanish. Is it a ch sound or a g sound? So they can hear that difference. Then we've got the catapult game, where they read the word and then they hear 2 pronunciations of that word and the 2 different watermelons. They choose the right one, and then if it's correct, they get to do a slingshot and try and break things, which is always fun. I think kids like being able to break stuff, basically. But yeah, this is moving on to the word level. And then the next challenge level is this wolf in sheep's clothing game, where they have lots of different words on the sheep, and they have to hear the pronunciation and choose the one which is wrong and put it in the pen, and hopefully they've found the wolf. And as they go through, there are more and more sheep, so it gets more and more difficult. And yeah, these are really good fun games, and it's something which you can do in the class or you can do it at home as well. So I definitely recommend that you check those out if you're not a Language Nut subscriber. Okay, next stage, we're looking at practicing pronunciation. So that's once they've heard the difference, can they then replicate the word, the sound? So what I used to do a lot was use mirrors. I bulk bought a bunch of mirrors, although these days, frankly, phone cameras, if they are allowed phones in school, that can be really useful as well. So it's so helpful to be able to see mouth shape. They want to be able to see yours, and obviously this is something where it is really helpful if there isn't a mask, if you don't have to wear a mask in the classroom. Obviously very important to wear when it's needed, but this for phonics it's really helpful. They can see your mouth shape, and then can they replicate them themselves? So if you want to do an U sound, seeing that shape is really helpful. If they want to do like the Spanish the sound, seeing that it's not like a normal d, the tongue actually does come out the from between the teeth. So that's really helpful. Get them to look at themselves. You know, they always feel weird, but it's so helpful. Second thing is break down the steps as much as possible. This is something we're adding on to Language Nuts, so some sort of really physical descriptions of what you do with your teeth and your tongue and your lips and so on. But if not, think about what you do when you make those sounds and break them down. So for example, whenever I taught the E sound in French and in German, I used to tell them, right, I want everyone to make an E, and then you push your lips in together and round them. So you go E, E, and you really break that down and get E. Then you gradually can get them to go straight into the U without having to go via the E, but practice really breaking it down. Sometimes it'd be fairly simple. There was a point when it was really easy to teach because everyone was doing duck face. So you can use whatever people are doing, use trends and so on, or any other way that you can get them to really break down those steps to physically make the shapes that they need to do to make those sounds. Another thing you can do for sounds that aren't in the target language, in the language of the student, so English in my case, is to find examples in word combinations or different ways. So for example, so I've been learning Arabic, and there are 2 S's in Arabic, and my teacher told me there's a silly S and a stupid S, and it hadn't really occurred to me, but the S in silly is different from the S in stupid. The S is a bit different, it's slightly thicker. So this is because of the assimilation we have to the next vowel or consonant. So think about silly S, stupid S, and I believe that in Spanish the S is a bit closer to the stupid S, so get them to think about that. The next symbol you can see in Russian and in Polish is a sh sound, which lots of people find really difficult, and the person who taught me that said you can say it if you go to a Chinese shop, a Chinese restaurant, and it's quite posh, you would call it a posh Chinese restaurant, and you would say that no problem, posh Chinese restaurant, posh Chine, it's there, you can say it, you just put it across word boundaries, so you don't think about it as being one word, but it is when you're speaking fluently. So doing that. What I did when I was teaching English in Germany, I had lots of German students who couldn't pronounce the W sound because it isn't generally a sound in German. However, if you say ouch in German, you say aua. They can say a W sound, it's just they're not used to it being as a part of a word, so it's aua, and thinking about that. And finally, another thing that you can use is accents. So I know that I have a very boring southern accent with a vestige of Suffolk in there, but obviously there are lots and lots of accents across the UK, and lots of phonics material tends to be quite focused on standard RP accents, but some accents will have different phonemes in them which are available in other languages. So for example, if you're in Liverpool or that kind of area, you already have a ch sound in chicken, or if you're in Scotland you have a ch sound in loch. So you can use that. Absolutely very important, there should never be any mocking of other accents. So if you're teaching in a different part of the UK or in the world where you don't have that accent, you can still use it, but obviously making sure that you're being very respectful about this, because accents are not something to be mocked. But if you are teaching in a different part of, for example, the UK, you can use the accent of your area in order to find different phonemes, which you might not have necessarily thought about. You can use noises, or you can use situations, and this is one where you absolutely can have a lot of fun with it. So when teaching ich, the h sound ich, I would get to hiss like cats. Most people can do a cat hiss, and therefore they can say ich. There is no reason for them to say ich. If you were teaching Spanish, the R sound is not that dissimilar to a pigeon's coo, like a r. If you can do a r, then you could do a r, and you can then put it into a word. So practicing that. An sound in French or in German, you can do a scenario. So imagining, you've stepped in something nasty, and get them to really enjoy it and think about the shape of their face and so on. And then put that into words as well. So have lots of fun with it. Footballers are a really useful resource that are there for us, and because you have players with different names which have different phonemes in them, that we're not necessarily used to in English, but students are used to them. So I may be out of date with some of these, but if they are known. Lots of students when I was teaching did know about Thierry Henry, and they might have called him Thierry Henry, but they knew it was an O, they knew it wasn't Henry. So they knew that the H wasn't pronounced, and they knew it was an O sound. So you can say O like an Henri, or Mbappe if you want an S sound, for example. So use footballers, and that's something you could also get students to think of as well. So you can ask them, can you think of an example? Here's a sound or a spelling combination. Can you think of footballers or place names or whatever that includes that? And finally, for practicing pronunciation, you can get students to record themselves, which is just to help them do it in the comfort of their own home, for example. So they can do it in the classroom as well. They can record themselves on mobile phones. They can record themselves on a laptop voice recorder. It could be part of a homework that they send it to you, or actually it could just be something for them, just getting them to do that as part of their practice, and they can maybe save recordings and hear how their accent gets better over time. And for language not subscribers, you can see this game here, which is one of my favourite ones, called Concerts, where we use voice recognition software, which is pretty good, if I do say so myself. And the students read a word, then they have to pronounce it, and if they get it correct, then the band sort of builds up and the audience builds up, and that's a really good fun one. So and also if they get it wrong, it will tell them what they said wrong. So for example, in this where it says Jose, if they said Jose, it will be spelt like that, so they can see what they've done wrong. So lots of tips there for doing pronunciation. And then generally, I'm just going to absolutely flood you with lots and lots of ideas, hopefully as practical as possible, and I hope there'll be things that you can do with your students. Phonics Slam, so lots of you will play Slam already. With vocabulary, we have flashcards or pictures on the board, and students have to, you say when the students be the first to touch them in a team. You can do it with phonics, so you could have phonic symbols, whatever ones you use, whether that's synthetic phonics, whether that's target language spelling or whatever, and if you say a word, the first one to hit the sound that is in there wins. You can do it with bingo, so a similar kind of idea where you say words, and if their word contains that sound, they can cross it off. You can do tennis, so you split the team into two, split the class into two. You say a sound, and they've got to take it in turn. Anyone from that team has to say a word that has that sound in it. You can do noughts and crosses with minimal pairs. This requires maybe a bit of sort of higher level sort of language, because they have to have enough vocabulary to be able to have the minimal pairs, because sometimes the vocabulary can be a bit complex, but it can be really, really powerful, particularly at a high level. So you have, words like, for example, tu and tout in French and other ones like that. And they play noughts and crosses, but in order to put their cross or circle or nought in the box, they have to say the word. If they say tu when they mean tout, or vice versa, you put it where they said, and then you can do that as a whole class, or you can do it in pairs as well, if they've been feeling pretty ruthless, because they tend to be pretty ruthless with each other. Correct the teacher. So you say a sentence or a words, and when you get things wrong, or you can be reading from a text, if you get things wrong, then they have to correct you. And faulty echo is where you say a sentence first and then you say it again, but you change one thing, you make a mistake. Often this is known as a game where you do it with sort of sentence builders, and you maybe get a word different, but you can do it with phonics easily as well, so you can make a mistake in that, and the students have to decide what it is that you've done wrong. Again, this is all about really getting their ear tuned. Quatsch is a fun game I used to play with my German students, but Quatsch is a German word meaning nonsense, but you can use it, whatever word you want to use in the language that you teach. And this is a pair game, or it can be a whole class game. You have a piece of text, one student starts reading, and if they make a pronunciation mistake, the other person says Quatsch or nonsense or whatever, they have to correct them, and then they can carry on reading. And I often used to do this whole class, and the rule was whoever was reading at the end got a sweet or a point or something, depending on how generous I was feeling. And so they were really, really ruthless, picking each other, really getting that pronunciation right. So with the right kind of class, that can work really nicely. Or, as I said, it can be done in pairs as well, although probably without the reward, but just whoever wins, the person speaking at the end. You can do phonic dictations. So you do a dictation, but instead of just writing it straight away in the normal way, they first of all transcribe it in their own phonetic notes, so whatever way they want to do it. So I'm not suggesting they write it in IPA, but they write it, out phonetically, essentially. Then they put it into the correct spelling. They look at it again, and then you can also do it reverse. So you can give them the correct spelling, and they have to put that into transcribing it. And this just means that they really break down the stages. It's really useful for listening. They break down those stages of they hear this wall of sound. They transcribe that wall of sound. Exactly what do they hear? And then they think about, okay, so how does it actually transcribe into words? And that can just really sometimes give students a lot more confidence when it comes to listening. And on sound spelling links, once you've really got that sorted, you can then give them unfamiliar place names, which is quite fun. And you can use Realia for this. So these are some French and German street names are quite useful, or you can use sometimes actually quite funny. You can find funny place names, cities, villages, or whatever, and get them to see if they can pronounce how it would be said in those languages. And a game that the minor always used to love, which is you get them to read an English text. I used to use song lyrics sometimes, and I used to get them to read English according to the phonic rules of the language we were learning as well. Again, just to really get them thinking about that. And it always ends up sounding nonsense, and they used to really like that. So anything you can do to just get them practicing again and again. Again, if you're a LanguageNet subscriber, we have a really fun game called Guacamole. So it's like whack-a-mole, but the little avocados come up. You know, I'm a millennial, what can I say? And they have to choose. They don't hear it. They read the words, and they have to whack all the avocados that have that sound in them. Which sometimes it's kind of easy because it's that letter, but other times, for example, with the g and the ch, a j is usually a ch, but a g can either be gente or gato in Spanish. They can be either one. So that's a really nice way of getting them to practice in a fun way the sound spelling links. And finally from me, tongue twisters and poems are really, really useful. I'm sure lots of you use them already as well, but some ideas here. So I will do my best. So for French, les chaussettes de l'archiduchesse sont elles sèches, archi sèches is really good for, you know, the sh sounds. And un chasseur sache un chasser, c'est chasser sans son chien. It's not easy. In German, I've got Brautkleid bleibt Brautkleid und Blaukraut bleibt Blaukraut. Again, really good for the like the ow and the I sounds and the r. If you've got any suggestions yourself, you could please do put them in the chat, because it's always good to share them. And I'm sure if you search social media, that always, you know, language teachers are always really generous with their resources. So if you've got ideas, that's great. Poems are really good because it's so much of it is getting students to enjoy the sound of language, and I find that phonics can really help with that. So this is a poem I loved teaching with German, and it's a nonsense poem. So it doesn't matter if you're not a German speaker, but I'm going to read a little bit of it just to show you what I mean. This is also part of my agenda that German is a beautiful language. So it's a nonsense poem with some very strange images, but it just sounds really nice. So, wenn die Möpse Schnäpse trinken, wenn vom Spiegel Igel stehen, wenn vor Föhren Bären winken, wenn die Ochsen boxen gehen, wenn im Schlafe Schlafe blöken, wenn im Tal ein Weine scheint, wenn im Wecken Schnecken stecken, wenn die Meise leise weint. I won't read the whole thing, but they really like the sound of that even before they've seen it, even before they know what it means. It just sounds really fun. And I'm sure there are lots of poems you have in other languages that you teach. Again, if you've got any great ideas, please do share them because it's really great to share resources. And finally, songs. There is something very musical about learning languages, and if you have a musical ear and you can hear the sounds of another language, those skills are linked. So if you're a German teacher, Oberammergau, you might know, which is a tongue twister, where it's Ober, aber, über, Oberammergau, oder Ober, über uns Ammergau, oder Ober, überhaupt nicht kommt, ist noch nicht raus. It's a tongue twister in a song, which was really fun, about two towns in Bavaria, to whichever route you might go via Oberammergau or Unterammergau. If you teach Spanish, so veo is, and I apologize for my pronunciation because I'm not a Spanish teacher, but I think that's really useful because it has lots of the sounds. It's essentially I spy, but includes yeah, a lot of different vowel sounds. On YouTube, Alain Lelay has lots of songs on there, which you could use for, I think not specifically phonics based songs, but you can use songs for listening out for particular sounds that you're teaching. And if you're a Language Up Primary subscriber, we have songs on there as well, so you could check those out in the teacher admin area. And yeah, again, using them, play them, get students to listen, repeat and sing them, look out for particular sounds, lots and lots of ideas. Okay, and then I'm going to pass over to my colleague Elaine, who's going to talk about some more ideas.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Zoe, for those loads and loads of ideas there. I'm sure people will be able to come up with something that they can use in the classroom tomorrow. That sounds great. So what can you do now? It's a big thing is phonics, as we know, moving forward, and there's lots of different things you can do. First of all, don't panic if you're not teaching phonics. There's lots of stuff that you can do, and there's lots of people out there sharing resources on social media, but also lots and lots of different platforms that you can find ideas from and make it what you want it to make in your situation at your school. You could add your sound symbol correspondences to your current scheme of work, so don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and start again. Just look at your current scheme of learning or curriculum, whatever you call it in your school, and see where you can add some explicit phonic teaching, or you may already be doing it and you're not actually, it's not something you thought that you're doing, but you actually are. When I was working in my previous role as a trust, we put together a scheme of work across the trust for all the schools to use for secondary, and we sort of made a particular column in the scheme of learning, which allowed us to then highlight which sounds we were using, we were retrieving, we were revisiting, and that way we could find, we could easily see what we were doing. And again, if you go to the appendices that are in the new GCSE specification, which are in the public domain, you can find all of the sound correspondence spelling links that you need. Obviously, lots of ideas tonight from Zoe, and you could gather some of those ideas and resources for practicing. speak to your English department. If you're in primary, you probably are used to doing a lot of phonics anyway, but if you are the linguist person working in a primary and you just teach languages, which some people do, then you could actually go and speak to your colleagues that are delivering phonics and see if there's anything that they're doing that you maybe could pull on. Another thing you could do is you could front load in the first half term in year 7 with a lot of phonics teaching. So flood your students with nothing but phonics and content, obviously, but a real heavy focus on phonics, and then respond to the issues as they crop up as you're teaching them. Talking about interweaving it into your schema work, you could, if you felt that you wanted to start with the phonics, you could then just start again and just go through your schema work if you're in a position of changing over your curriculum, as I know a lot of people are rewriting curricular plans and everything. There's all sorts of things going on. So you might well just start with thinking, right, how can I interleave it? You might decide not to actually explicitly teach phonics, but just to raise awareness of it when an exercise arises or when it comes out of your teaching. But I would suggest you keep a tight rein there on what you are actually teaching when that does, so that then you do know what sounds you've actually taught. As Zoe said, there's lots of different resources there, and she mentioned lots of them. You could just decide to buy or subscribe to, like on Language Note with our phonics, a particular standalone set of resources and just use that and work through that at your own pace or at the pace that is suggested in their own schemes. But what is definitely certain, if you are teaching the new GCSE, you will need to incorporate read aloud, and you will need to do that with your dictation because they are going to be in the specification. I remember looking at this 4 years ago, I think, when I was writing some assessments along with another colleague for my old trust that I worked for, and we actually built this into our year 7 schema work 4 years ago so that students were having to do a read aloud then. So kind of students who are in year 10 now will probably be used to that, but going forward, that's something that you really need to think about if you are going to be following the English curriculum. Okay, I will pass you back to Zoe now, who I'm sure has got some questions in the chat that we could answer. Before I do sign off back to Zoe, if you've enjoyed tonight's session, please shout out on Twitter or on Facebook and let people know that the recording will be available on our site over the next few days. And obviously, if you want to any information or to have a free trial and demo of Language Note, our addresses are on that on the slide that Zoe is now showing. Okay, pass over to you, Zoe.
Great, thanks very much. And yeah, as Elaine says, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. So we've got a couple, and while I'm answering those, if you have any more, please do write them. So one question is on from Lucia, so on asking about Phonics Slam. Yeah, with any of the resources, anything we talked about this evening, we will send out the PowerPoint. Some other people have asked about that as well, and this webinar is being recorded so that you can always have access to this later on as well, because I'm aware that I particularly have been speaking very fast, trying to get as many bits of information and many tips in as possible in the time, so you can listen back to it. But yeah, any more information you would like, please do contact either me or Elaine. So Zoe at languagenut.com or Elaine at languagenut.com. We'll be happy to share any resources that we have. And if you're interested in getting a trial of Language Nut, if you're not a subscriber, if you think the games look really fun, we've worked really hard on them and we think they're really good, then please do contact Daniel at languagenut.com and get you set up with a trial. I have a question from Bethan asking about the Language Nut resources, so whether they should be taught in a set order or they're completely standalone. So yeah, they don't have to be taught in a particular set order. What we've done with the content is, because we don't know what you will be teaching when, we want to make it as flexible as possible to all teachers and to all stages. So what we've done is we've gone for the simplest possible vocabulary that we can in the languages, and that uses those sounds. So they're all very, very basic vocabulary. They're not necessarily themed, so you can do them whichever order, and you might want to supplement them with specific themed vocabulary that you have, but we've tried to make it suitable for as anyone that we possibly can. So I don't have any other questions for the time being, but if you do think of anything afterwards, l'esprit d'escalier is very common, I'm sure. Please do email either me or Elaine. And if you have any feedback, as Elaine said, please do let us know in the chat, or please contact us. If you found this useful, please do let your colleagues know and put it on your social media so that they can watch it as well, because we do want to, share our expertise and our experience, with as many people as we can. Also, one last question. Someone said, isn't this or that exposing them to the incorrect words and therefore reinforcing the wrong pronunciation? Yeah, there's an argument to that. I was thinking more that if you're looking at different contrasting sounds, so if you or easily confused sounds, so for example the u and the u, so yeah, obviously anytime when you have any kind of correcting the mistake problem, or same with faulty echo or anything like that, there is that danger, which is why it's really important to then afterwards make sure that you make it very clear to everybody they have the correct one. To be honest, they probably will hear the incorrect pronunciation amongst their peers or other learners anyway, so I think actually then doing that explicitly and getting them to hear the difference can be really useful. So yeah, any other questions that you have, please do send them through. Would love to answer them another time, but I think we'll end it there and let you all finish your days and get home. So thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, we have the webinar on Wednesday for early careers teachers and newly qualified teachers, and please do let us know what you think and have a great evening.
Bye.